On the morning of March 3rd, 1943, as the tropical sun climbed over the waters of Huon Gulf near New Guinea, the officers standing watch aboard the Japanese destroyer Yukikaze witnessed something that defied their understanding of modern warfare. Through their binoculars, they observed 12 twin-engine bombers approaching their convoy, but these aircraft weren't following any tactical doctrine they'd ever studied or encountered. The planes were flying impossibly low, their altitude so minimal that the wash from their propellers actually created visible trails across the surface of the water itself. The sight was so unorthodox, so contrary to established military thinking, that it took precious seconds for the implications to register in their minds. Within the span of just 15 minutes from that first sighting, these officers would bear witness to the complete and utter destruction of Japanese naval capability in the Southwest Pacific Theater, an annihilation so thorough and so rapid that it would fundamentally alter the strategic calculus of the entire war. The convoy steaming through those waters represented a critical lifeline for Japanese forces, transporting 6,900 desperately needed troops aboard 8 different transport vessels. These weren't just any soldiers, but reinforcements that Japanese commanders had deemed essential for maintaining their positions in New Guinea. 4 destroyer escorts, vessels that had successfully protected countless convoys across the vast Pacific since the opening salvos at Pearl Harbor, formed a protective screen around the transports. These warships represented the accumulated experience and tactical expertise of the Imperial Japanese Navy, crews who had survived multiple combat engagements and knew their business well. Yet all that experience, all that expertise, all those carefully honed tactical skills would prove utterly inadequate against what was bearing down on them. By the time the sun reached its zenith that day, every single one of those 8 transport ships would be transformed into burning wreckage, slowly sinking beneath the waves or already resting on the ocean floor. The 4 destroyer escorts would be shattered, some destroyed outright, others so badly damaged they'd never sail again. Along with the ships, 2,890 Japanese soldiers and sailors would perish in the waters of the Bismarck Sea, and with them would sink every assumption the Imperial Japanese Navy had made about the nature of air-sea combat. What the Japanese commanders couldn't have known, what they had no way of anticipating, was that these weren't conventional bombers executing a standard attack profile. The aircraft closing on their convoy were B-25 Mitchell medium bombers, but they'd been radically transformed by an unconventional engineer named Paul Gunn, a man his colleagues called Pappy. Gunn had taken these standard military aircraft and converted them into something entirely new, something that existed nowhere in military doctrine or tactical manuals. Each of his modified bombers carried 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns, a concentration of firepower that was simply unprecedented for an aircraft of this type. But the modifications went beyond just the guns. These bombers had been purpose-built to execute a completely novel form of attack, one that their crews had practiced extensively, but which no Japanese officer had ever conceived as possible. Rather than approaching from altitude and releasing their bombs in the traditional manner, these aircraft would come in at wave-top height, using their devastating forward armament to suppress defensive fire, then literally skip their bombs across the water's surface like children skipping stones across a pond. The bombs would bounce along the waves before slamming into the hulls of enemy ships, their specially designed delayed fuses ensuring they'd detonate inside the target vessels, rather than harmlessly against their exterior armour. The convoy that had departed from Rabaul just after midnight on March 1st, 1943, represented far more than a simple transport mission. This was the last major attempt by Japanese forces to reinforce their garrison at Leh using surface vessels, and everyone involved understood the stakes. General Hitoshi Imamura, commanding the 8th Area Army, had identified these reinforcements as absolutely critical for maintaining Japanese control of New Guinea, which in turn represented the final defensive barrier protecting the southern flank of the Japanese Empire itself. If New Guinea fell, the entire defensive perimeter would be compromised, opening up new avenues for Allied advances toward the Japanese home islands. The convoy's composition reflected its importance. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura commanded an escort force of 8 destroyers, and these weren't newly commissioned vessels with green crews, but battle-hardened warships that had seen extensive combat throughout the Pacific campaign. The destroyers Shirayuki, Shikinami, Uranami, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Asashio, Arashio, and Asagumo formed a carefully arranged protective ring around the 8 transport ships they were charged with defending. Those transports, the Ayomaru, Kenbo Maru, Kyokusei Maru, Oigawa Maru, Shinai Maru, Taimei Maru, Teo Maru, and the naval auxiliary vessel Nojima, collectively carried the entire 51st Division, those 6,900 elite troops, along with enough supplies and ammunition to sustain the Leh garrison for several months of operations. The planning that had gone into this convoy's departure had been meticulous, with Japanese meteorologists studying weather patterns and predicting 3 full days of storms that would provide perfect cover from American air reconnaissance. Additionally, 100 Zero fighters stationed at bases scattered across New Britain and New Guinea were tasked with providing continuous air cover throughout the convoy's journey. The route itself had been carefully selected to hug the northern coastline of New Britain, minimizing the time the ships would spend exposed in open water where they'd be most vulnerable to air attack. Captain Tamaichi Hara, who commanded the destroyer Yukikaze and would later write his memoirs as Japanese destroyer captain, had been noticing disturbing trends in recent weeks. American bomber tactics had been evolving, with aircraft attacking at progressively lower altitudes and displaying modifications to their standard configurations that suggested some kind of systematic experimentation was underway. When Hara voiced these concerns to his superior officers, his observations were generally dismissed as overreaction. The prevailing view among senior Japanese commanders was that the Americans were simply growing desperate, making tactical mistakes born of frustration rather than implementing any coherent new strategy. This complacency would prove catastrophic. What those senior officers didn't realize, what they couldn't have known, was that a revolution in aerial warfare had been quietly taking place in the Allied workshops scattered around Port Moresby and Townsville. Beginning in August of 1942, Major Paul Gunn, who'd previously served as a Navy pilot before transitioning to the Army Air Forces, had been systematically transforming standard medium bombers into weapons that no military planner had ever imagined. Gunn's innovations emerged not from theoretical considerations or laboratory research, but from stark necessity confronting the realities of combat in the Pacific theatre. Traditional high-altitude bombing tactics against naval vessels had proven almost completely ineffective, with hit rates consistently falling below 1%. When bombardiers released their weapons from altitudes around 10,000 feet, even the most skilled among them found it nearly impossible to hit moving targets. Ships' captains could observe bombs falling from that height and had several minutes to execute evasive maneuvers, dodging the incoming ordnance. Furthermore, anti-aircraft fire proved remarkably effective at those medium altitudes, making the bombing runs themselves extremely hazardous for the attacking aircraft. Something radically different was required if American bombers were going to have any meaningful impact on Japanese naval operations. Working with whatever salvaged parts he could scavenge from wrecked fighter aircraft, Gunn began installing 4 50-caliber machine guns in the nose sections of B-25 bombers. This required replacing the bombardier's glazed compartment, that transparent nose section through which bombardiers traditionally aimed their weapons, with solid metal housing that could support the gun mounts. He didn't stop there, though. Gunn added 4 additional machine guns in packages mounted below the cockpit on either side of the aircraft's centerline, bringing the total forward-firing armament to 8 heavy machine guns. Each of these weapons could fire 850 rounds per minute, with each bullet travelling at approximately 2,910 feet per second upon leaving the barrel. The armour-piercing ammunition they fired was designed to penetrate ship hulls and destroy vital equipment. When all 8 guns fired simultaneously, which they did since they were all controlled by a single trigger mechanism, a single B-25 could deliver 6,800 bullets per minute in a concentrated stream of fire directed wherever the pilot aimed the aircraft's nose. Parallel to guns' work on firepower, Major Ed Lana's 90th Bomb Squadron, which was part of the 3rd Bomb Group, had spent weeks perfecting an entirely novel bombing technique. The concept was straightforward, but required extraordinary precision in execution. Flying at altitudes of 200 feet or even less, bomber crews would release 500-pound bombs equipped with specially configured delay fuses. Rather than exploding on impact, these bombs would skip across the water's surface, much like a flat stone thrown by a skilled hand, bouncing multiple times before finally slamming into the hull of an enemy ship. The delay fuses were carefully set to detonate 4 to 5 seconds after release, which provided just enough time for the attacking bomber to clear the area before the explosion occurred, thus protecting the aircraft from damage caused by its own weapon. The technique demanded extensive practice, and crews used the wreck of the SS Pruth, which lay in Port Moresby Harbour, as their training target. They practiced relentlessly until they could consistently achieve hits against this stationary target, gradually refining their understanding of the optimal parameters. Through countless practice runs, they established that the ideal attack profile required an altitude between 200 and 250 feet, an airspeed of 200 to 250 miles per hour, and bomb release at a distance of 60 to 100 feet from the target vessel. These parameters represented the sweet spot where the bomb would skip properly, the aircraft would remain stable enough for accurate release, and the crew would escape the subsequent explosion safely. Every element had to work together perfectly. The storm cover that Japanese meteorologists had predicted for the convoy's journey began breaking up earlier than their forecasts had indicated. At 10 o'clock in the morning on March 2nd, a B-25 Liberator on routine reconnaissance duties spotted the ships through a gap in the cloud cover. The pilot immediately radioed the sighting back to base, and within hours, 28 B-17 Flying Fortresses from the 43rd Bombardment Group were airborne from Port Moresby, fully loaded with bombs and heading toward the convoy's reported position. These B-17s attacked from an altitude of 7,000 feet, which was lower than their typical operating altitude, but still high enough to remain above the effective range of most anti-aircraft fire from the ships below. They bracketed the convoy with 1,000-pound demolition bombs, walking their bomb patterns across the formation of ships. At 2:45 in the afternoon, the transport ship Kyokusei Maru took direct hits on her forward cargo holds, where much of her ammunition was stored. Fires quickly spread to those ammunition stores, and within minutes the situation aboard the vessel had become untenable, forcing the captain to give the order to abandon ship. 900 soldiers were evacuated from the burning transport, divided between the destroyers Yukikaze and Asagumo. These two destroyers, now carrying far more personnel than they'd been designed to accommodate, raced ahead of the main convoy at high speed, pushing their engines to the limit as they made for Leh. Their mission was to deposit these rescued soldiers safely ashore before rejoining the convoy for the continuation of its journey. They succeeded in this emergency evacuation run, landing the troops and then racing back to rejoin the convoy in the early hours of March 3rd. However, this emergency operation had reduced the convoy's escort strength during a critical period when every destroyer was needed. What the Japanese commanders failed to realize was that the B-17 attack had served a dual purpose beyond simply attempting to sink ships. It had been what military planners call reconnaissance by fire, a deliberate operation designed to test the convoy's defensive capabilities while simultaneously forcing the ships to break their tight formation. Allied planners had intentionally used high-altitude bombing as their opening move, knowing it would provide valuable intelligence about the Japanese anti-aircraft capabilities, while also disrupting the convoy's organization in preparation for what would come next. The morning of March 3rd dawned with clear skies over Huon Gulf, and that clarity represented a disaster for the Japanese convoy. Throughout the night, the ships had rounded the Huon Peninsula and were now steaming through open water, completely exposed to air attack. They were only 80 miles from their destination at Leh, close enough that safety seemed almost within reach, near enough to taste but not yet achieved. At 7:55 in the morning, lookouts posted aboard the Japanese ships spotted the first wave of attacking aircraft approaching from the south. But these planes weren't flying at 7,000 feet like the previous day's B-17s had been. These aircraft were skimming across the wavetops, flying so incredibly low that spray from their propellers was actually visible to observers on the ships. The sight was so unexpected, so contrary to every tactical assumption about how bombers operated, that it took several seconds for the Japanese officers to process what they were seeing. As the aircraft closed to approximately 2,000 yards, their noses suddenly erupted in streams of tracer fire. 8 separate lines of bullets from each B-25 converged on the Japanese ships, focusing particularly on their anti-aircraft positions. The concentrated firepower was devastating and immediate. Japanese gunners attempting to man their defensive weapons were cut down by the bullets before they could effectively engage the attacking aircraft. Those crew members who dove for cover to escape the strafing were unable to operate their guns, meaning they couldn't defend their ships. This was the brilliance of the tactic. By suppressing the defensive fire, the strafing B-25s were paving the way for the bombers that would follow. Behind the American aircraft came Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters from No. 30 Squadron, adding their own substantial firepower to the suppression effort. Each Beaufighter carried 4 20mm cannons and 6.303 caliber machine guns, all capable of firing forward. The combined assault from American and Australian aircraft was simply overwhelming, creating a curtain of fire that made it virtually impossible for Japanese defenders to effectively operate their anti-aircraft weapons across the entire convoy. At precisely 10 o'clock in the morning, Major Ed Larner led 12 B-25s from the 91st Bomb Squadron into their attack run. They approached in flights of 3 aircraft each, maintaining an altitude of just 200 feet while their airspeed held steady at 250 miles per hour. This was the moment that months of training had prepared them for, the culmination of all those practice runs against the wreck in Port Moresby Harbour. The lead bomber released its weapon approximately 300 yards from the transport ship Shinai Maru. The bomb struck the water and skipped forward, bouncing across the surface before slamming into the ship's hull just above the waterline. 4 to 5 seconds after release, exactly as the delayed fuse had been designed to function, the bomb detonated inside the cargo hold. The explosion ripped the ship apart from within, opening her hull like a tin can being split by a can opener. The transport Kenbo Maru, which was loaded with drums of aviation fuel destined for Japanese air bases, took a skip bomb amidships. When that bomb detonated among all that volatile fuel, it ignited the entire cargo, creating a massive fireball that rose 500 feet into the air. The ship essentially disintegrated in seconds, leaving nothing but burning debris scattered across the water's surface. The Iomaru absorbed multiple direct hits in rapid succession, with bombs from different aircraft all finding their mark. Her hull was opened in several places, and she began sinking almost immediately. The Oigawa Maru, with her captain desperately trying to maneuver away from the attacking aircraft, took bombs from 2 different B-25s in quick succession. The explosions broke her back, causing the ship to jackknife in the water before going down within just a few minutes. The destroyer Asashio, under the command of Captain Yasuo Sato, raced to position herself between the attackers and the vulnerable transports she was supposed to protect. She was immediately bracketed by 3 different B-25s executing coordinated attacks. Skip bombs slammed into her engine rooms, destroying her propulsion, while thousands of machine gun bullets swept across her decks, killing exposed crew members and destroying equipment. Dead in the water and burning fiercely, she became a stationary target for the following waves of attackers. By 10:15 in the morning, exactly 15 minutes after Major Larner's initial bomb had been released, 7 of the 8 transport ships were either already sunk or in the process of sinking. 3 destroyers, the Asashio, Arashio, and Tokitsukaze, had been mortally wounded and would not survive the day. The Shirayuki would sink later from accumulated damage. The convoy, which just hours before had been steaming confidently toward its destination, had effectively ceased to exist as an organized force. The destruction of the ships, as catastrophic as it was, represented only the beginning of the tragedy that would unfold in the Huon Gulf. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, many of whom had never learned to swim, were thrown into the oil-covered waters when their ships went down or were abandoned. Those men who possessed swimming skills faced a terrible choice. They could attempt to reach the New Guinea coast, which meant swimming through waters infested with sharks and fighting dangerous currents that could sweep them out to sea, or they could cling to floating debris and hope for rescue from the few Japanese ships that remained operational. The destroyer Shikinami, one of the few escort vessels still capable of maneuvering, began the grim work of pulling survivors from the water. Captain Masamichi Ueno's crew worked frantically, hauling men aboard as quickly as they possibly could. They managed to save approximately 300 men in the first hour of rescue operations. But then the American planes returned for follow-up attacks. The subsequent attacks on March 4th specifically targeted lifeboats and rafts carrying survivors. Machine gun fire churned the sea into foam around these vulnerable targets. Life rafts were shredded under concentrated gunfire. PT boats also participated in the follow-up operations, actively working to prevent Japanese survivors from reaching the shore, following orders designed to ensure that enemy soldiers wouldn't be able to reinforce the Leh garrison that the entire operation had been designed to support. For those Japanese military observers who survived the attacks and made it back to Japanese-controlled territory, the experience revealed a devastating truth about how far American tactical innovation had advanced. The skip bombing technique, which had been developed and perfected in just a matter of months, had no counter-tactic anywhere in Japanese military doctrine. Ships couldn't depress their anti-aircraft guns far enough to effectively engage planes flying at mast height. Torpedoes, which might theoretically be used against surface vessels, were completely useless against aircraft. All the traditional anti-aircraft doctrine that Japanese crews had trained on and practiced was rendered irrelevant by this new form of attack. The firepower of the modified B-25s was particularly shocking to Japanese survivors who observed the attacks. Japanese fighter aircraft typically carried two 7.7mm machine guns, occasionally supplemented by 20mm cannons for aircraft assigned to anti-bomber roles. These American bombers carried 8 50-caliber machine guns, representing the combined firepower of multiple fighter aircraft, all aimed forward in a single direction, all controlled by one pilot's trigger. Even more disturbing to Japanese analysts was the level of coordination displayed by the attacking forces. The operation had involved American B-17 conducting the initial high-altitude attacks, B-25 executing the skip bombing runs, A-20 attack bombers from the 3rd Attack Group providing additional firepower, and Australian Beaufighters adding their weapons to the suppression efforts. Over 100 aircraft from different units, different services, and even different nations had worked together in perfect synchronization. They maintained radio communication throughout the entire battle, adjusting their tactics in real time based on reports being transmitted between aircraft. This level of coordination was something Japanese forces simply couldn't match, hampered as they were by service rivalries and inadequate communication systems. As night fell on March 3rd, the surviving Japanese destroyers returned to the battle site, searching desperately through the darkness for any survivors they could rescue. They found a sea covered with debris and corpses, with oil fires still burning on the water's surface in multiple locations. The destroyer Hatsuyuki arrived from Kavieng carrying additional fuel, which allowed the rescue operations to continue through the night and into the following day. In total, approximately 2,700 men were pulled from the water and returned to Rabaul, though many of these survivors were wounded or suffering from exposure. Another 1,200 soldiers, including those who had been landed from the Kyokusei Maru before the main attack, eventually made it to Leh through various means. Of the 6,900 troops who had departed Rabaul with high hopes of reinforcing the New Guinea garrison, 2,890 were dead, lost in the waters of the Bismarck Sea. The 51st Division, which was supposed to provide fresh combat power for Japanese operations, had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force before firing a single shot at enemy forces. All the ammunition, food, medicine, and equipment that were supposed to sustain operations for months had gone down with the transport ships. The aviation fuel that had been loaded aboard the Kenbo Maru, fuel that was supposed to keep Japanese aircraft flying for weeks, was now nothing more than a slick on the surface of the Bismarck Sea. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who served as Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet, received the battle report while in his cabin aboard the battleship Musashi, which was anchored at the major Japanese fleet base at Truk. According to staff officers who were present when he received the news, Yamamoto sat in complete silence for an extended period before speaking. The implications of what had happened were immediately clear to him. Japan could no longer reinforce its forward garrisons by surface convoy within the range of Allied aircraft. The naval lifeline that connected Japanese-held bases to their sources of supply had been severed. The strategic significance of what had happened in the Bismarck Sea extended far beyond the immediate tactical defeat. It represented a fundamental shift in how the Pacific War would be fought. Never again would Japanese forces attempt to reinforce their garrisons by surface convoy when those routes lay within range of Allied aircraft. General Imamura flew personally to Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo to deliver his report on what had occurred. In a meeting that extended for 6 hours, he presented evidence demonstrating that American air power had evolved beyond Japanese ability to effectively counter it. The Americans weren't simply building more aircraft, though they were certainly doing that in vast numbers. More importantly, they were revolutionizing how aircraft were used in combat, developing entirely new tactics faster than Japanese forces could develop responses. On March 25, 1943, a joint Army-Navy Central Agreement on Southwest Area Operations designated operations in New Guinea as having priority over those being conducted in the Solomon Islands. But without the ability to reinforce positions by sea, this prioritization was essentially meaningless. Japanese forces in New Guinea would have to fight without any realistic hope of receiving significant reinforcements or resupply via surface vessels. For American forces, the victory validated 2 years of innovation and adaptation in the Pacific theater. General George Kenney, who commanded the 5th Air Force, had systematically transformed his command from a traditional bombing unit into something unprecedented in military history, an aerial navy capable of controlling sea lanes without requiring actual naval vessels. Major Ed Larner, whose 91st Squadron had led the skip bombing attack that destroyed the convoy, was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his exceptional leadership. The citation specifically praised his extraordinary achievement in leading the attack that had destroyed the Japanese convoy. Tragically, Larner would die just 58 days later, on April 30, 1943, when his B-25 crashed during landing at Dobodura airfield. He had survived 87 combat missions, only to perish in an accident at his own base. The North American Aviation Company, which manufactured the B-25 Mitchell bomber, immediately began incorporating Papigun's field modifications into their factory production processes. By late 1943, B-25G models were rolling off the assembly lines with built-in forward firepower and even a 75mm cannon mounted in the nose, though this cannon would ultimately prove less practical than the multiple machine guns. The B-25H model would carry 14 forward-firing machine guns, while the B-25J could be configured with as many as 18 guns, making it one of the most heavily armed aircraft produced during the entire war. Beyond all the strategic and tactical implications, the events at Bismarck Sea represented a profound human tragedy on a scale that statistics can only partially capture. The 2,890 Japanese who died weren't merely numbers in casualty reports. They were sons and fathers and husbands. Many of them were conscripts who had been farmers, clerks, or students in their civilian lives before being drafted into a war they barely understood. For the American pilots who participated in the strafing runs against survivors in the water, The military necessity of preventing enemy soldiers from reaching shore and reinforcing the garrison didn't make those actions any easier to bear psychologically. Some aircrew members reported experiencing nightmares about those missions for years after the war ended. The success achieved at Bismarck Sea triggered an acceleration of American tactical innovation across the Pacific theater. Within just a few months, new techniques were being developed and implemented at a rapid pace. Parafrags, which were parachute-equipped fragmentation bombs, were developed for attacking airfields, allowing low-level bombing without risking damage to the attacking aircraft from their own bomb blasts. White phosphorus bombs were introduced for marking targets, making it easier for following aircraft to identify and attack specific objectives. Skip bombing fuses were improved with more reliable delay mechanisms that reduced the already low failure rate even further. Each innovation built upon industrial capacity that allowed experimentation on a scale Japan simply couldn't match. Americans could afford to experiment because when experiments failed, the cost was measured only in materials, and materials were essentially unlimited given American industrial production. Japanese innovation increasingly stagnated because every experiment consumed irreplaceable resources that couldn't be easily replaced. By contrast to American adaptation and innovation, Japanese forces increasingly turned to spiritual rather than material solutions to their growing disadvantages. The kamikaze concept, using pilots as human-guided missiles, emerged partly from recognition that Japan couldn't match American technology or production. If Japanese forces couldn't outbuild the Americans or out-innovate them, the thinking went, they would try to outdie them, demonstrating a level of sacrifice that American forces wouldn't be willing to match. Crucial to the American victory at Bismarck Sea had been code-breaking intelligence that provided detailed advance knowledge of the convoy's plans. The Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne, working in conjunction with naval intelligence offices in Washington, had successfully decrypted Japanese radio messages that revealed the convoy's schedule, route, and exact composition. General Kenny had known precisely when and where to position his forces for maximum effect. This intelligence advantage had to be carefully protected at all costs. Allied planners deliberately staged reconnaissance flights that would ostensibly discover the convoy through visual observation, maintaining the fiction that it was aircraft spotting rather than signals intelligence that had provided the warning. This deception was executed so skillfully that Japanese forces never realized their communication codes had been compromised, and they continued using the same encryption systems throughout the war, systems that American cryptographers could read essentially in real time. The Royal Australian Air Force's participation in the battle demonstrated the exceptional level of coordination that Allied forces had achieved. RAF Beaufighters from No. 30 Squadron and Bostons from No. 22 Squadron flew alongside American aircraft, communicating on the same radio frequencies and following the same tactical plans. The integration of Australian and American forces stood in stark contrast to Japanese military operations, where Army and Navy units rarely coordinated effectively with each other, often competing for limited resources rather than cooperating against their common enemy. Behind every modified B-25 that attacked the convoy lay an incredible supply chain that stretched all the way back to factories in the continental United States. Each B-25 aircraft required 165,000 individual parts, manufactured in dozens of different states by hundreds of different suppliers. The .50 caliber ammunition they fired was produced in plants scattered from Connecticut to California, with American factories manufacturing billions of rounds during the course of the war. The special delayed action fuses that made skip bombing possible were precision instruments manufactured by the millions in American munitions plants. The fuel consumed in training flights and combat operations came from Texas oil fields and Louisiana refineries. Replacement parts for damaged aircraft arrived weekly by cargo ship from the United States, ensuring that maintenance crews always had the components they needed to keep aircraft flying. This vast and complex supply chain operated while America was simultaneously fighting in Europe, supplying Britain and the Soviet Union with massive quantities of equipment through Lend-Lease, and maintaining military forces scattered across the Pacific theatre. The Japanese convoy destroyed at Bismarck Sea represented Japan's maximum effort to reinforce New Guinea, the absolute limit of what Japanese logistics could support. The forces that destroyed that convoy represented merely a tiny fraction of total American production capability deployed in just one theatre of a global war. The American pilots who devastated the Japanese convoy had averaged approximately 400 hours of flight time before entering combat operations. They had practiced the skip bombing technique for weeks, using virtually unlimited supplies of fuel and ammunition for training. Each pilot had dropped dozens of practice bombs before executing the actual mission, refining their technique until it became almost second nature. By contrast, Japanese pilots entering combat in 1943 increasingly arrived at frontline units with less than 100 hours of total flight time. Fuel shortages meant that training had to be minimal, with students receiving only the absolute basics before being thrust into combat. The veteran pilots who might have served as instructors and passed on their accumulated knowledge were mostly dead, killed in the grinding attrition of continuous combat operations. The expertise they had gained at terrible cost was lost forever when they died. New Japanese pilots were essentially flying students being thrown into combat against experienced American aviators who had been thoroughly trained and had accumulated significant combat experience. After Bismarck Sea, Japanese forces in New Guinea found themselves strategically isolated with no realistic means of receiving adequate support. Supplies now had to be delivered by submarine, a method that was extremely dangerous and severely limited in the cargo capacity it could provide. Alternatively, fast destroyer runs at night, sometimes called the Tokyo Express by American forces, could deliver small quantities of supplies, but these operations were equally hazardous and wholly insufficient for supporting major military operations. These high-speed runs could deliver only a tiny fraction of what the destroyed convoy had carried. Attempting to adapt to these constraints, Japanese forces turned to using small barges, trying to creep along the coast at night with supplies, hugging the shoreline and hoping to avoid detection. These barges became prime targets for American PT boats and modified B-25s that had been equipped with radar for night hunting operations. By June 1943, Japanese forces in New Guinea had been reduced to half rations, with each soldier receiving barely enough food to sustain life. By September, men were eating grass, tree bark, and roots, anything that might provide minimal nutrition. The army that had conquered Singapore and swept through Southeast Asia in a matter of months was now literally starving to death, defeated not just by combat but by the systematic cutting of supply lines through air power. For Japanese military culture, which was deeply rooted in centuries of samurai tradition that emphasized personal combat, individual heroism, and warrior spirit, the industrialized slaughter at Bismarck Sea represented something almost incomprehensible. How could one fight against an enemy who killed from a distance using overwhelming material superiority rather than engaging in direct combat? Japanese forces would increasingly resort to suicidal tactics as the war progressed, including banzai charges and kamikaze attacks, seeking what they considered meaningful death in the face of mechanized killing that seemed to render individual courage irrelevant. Americans would respond to these desperate tactics with even more firepower, more technology, more industrial solutions to military problems. The fundamental gap between traditional warrior culture and modern industrial warfare would only widen as the war continued. Pappy Gunn had installed automatic cameras in the tail sections of his modified B-25s, cameras that activated automatically whenever bombs were released from the aircraft. These cameras captured the destruction of the Japanese convoy in devastating detail, recording ships exploding, capsizing, and burning. The photographs provided unprecedented documentation of the battle's effectiveness, creating a visual record that could be studied and analyzed in ways that had never before been possible in naval combat. These images served multiple important purposes beyond simple documentation. They provided accurate battle damage assessment, allowing intelligence officers to verify pilot claims of ships destroyed with photographic evidence, rather than relying solely on verbal reports that might be inaccurate in the confusion of combat. The images became valuable training aids, showing future pilots exactly how skip bombing worked under actual combat conditions, demonstrating the proper release point, the skip pattern, and the resulting damage. The photographs also served as powerful propaganda tools, demonstrating American technological and tactical superiority to allies and enemies alike, visual proof that the American military had fundamentally changed the nature of air-sea combat. The Japanese military had no equivalent photographic capability in their aircraft, forcing them to rely primarily on pilot reports that were often inaccurate or exaggerated in the heat and confusion of combat. The B-25s that destroyed the convoy had been flying continuously for months in the extremely harsh conditions of New Guinea, exposed to tropical heat that could reach well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, humidity that bred corrosion on metal parts and electrical systems, and coral dust that abraded engines and damaged moving parts. Yet despite these challenging operating conditions, mechanical failures during the critical mission were extremely rare, a testament to both the aircraft's robust design and the skill of the maintenance crews. American engines were deliberately over-engineered, designed with power reserves and safety margins that allowed them to continue functioning even when not perfectly maintained or when operating in less than ideal conditions. Japanese aircraft, by contrast, suffered from increasingly poor maintenance as the war progressed and Japanese supply lines deteriorated. Spare parts became scarce, qualified mechanics even scarcer. Engines that were theoretically superior to American designs in terms of efficiency or power-to-weight ratio failed more frequently in actual combat conditions because they couldn't be properly maintained with the limited resources available. The Japanese Navy's prized Zero fighters, which had dominated the skies in the early months of the war, were increasingly grounded for lack of spare parts and properly trained maintenance personnel, while American aircraft continued flying daily combat missions with remarkable reliability. During the battle itself, American and Australian aircraft maintained constant radio communication, with pilots continuously reporting target locations, warning each other of enemy fighter attacks, and coordinating their approaches to maximize effectiveness. This real-time information sharing multiplied the combat effectiveness of the entire force, allowing aircraft to support each other and exploit fleeting opportunities as they emerged during the fluid combat situation. Japanese communications, by stark contrast, were minimal and frequently non-functional. Radio equipment was unreliable and prone to failure. Frequencies weren't standardized between different services or even between different units within the same service, and radio discipline was generally poor, with too many people talking over each other on the same frequencies. Ships and aircraft often fought in isolation, unable to coordinate effectively with each other or warn friendly units of approaching threats, reducing the overall effectiveness of defensive efforts. American pilots flew into battle with confidence, knowing that if they were shot down and wounded, they had excellent chances of survival. Blood plasma for treating shock, morphine for pain management, sulfur drugs, and eventually penicillin for preventing infection were all standard components in American medical kits. Medical evacuation by air was routine procedure, with wounded pilots often arriving at proper hospital facilities within hours of being shot down and rescued. Japanese soldiers and sailors, by contrast, knew that serious wounds very likely meant death. Medical supplies were desperately short even before the convoy's destruction eliminated months' worth of stockpiled medicines. The drugs and equipment that might have saved lives were now resting at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. This knowledge affected morale in profound ways. American pilots flew with confidence, secure in the knowledge that their nation would move heaven and earth to rescue and treat them if they were wounded. Japanese forces fought with the desperation of men who knew they were unlikely to receive adequate medical care if injured. The Battle of Bismarck Sea cost Japan ships and aircraft it absolutely couldn't afford to lose at this stage of the war. The 8 transport ships represented months of production from Japanese shipyards that were already strained far beyond their optimal capacity, struggling to replace combat losses while also building new vessels. The destroyed supplies and ammunition represented significant portions of total Japanese monthly production that couldn't be easily replaced given increasing resource shortages. For America, by contrast, the battle was economically insignificant, barely registering as a blip in the vast American war economy. The ammunition expended during the battle was replaced within days from enormous stockpiles scattered across the Pacific. The few aircraft lost were replaced within hours from reserves held at forward bases. American factories were producing approximately 100,000 aircraft annually by 1943, which worked out to nearly 300 complete aircraft every single day. The fuel burned in training exercises and combat operations represented such a small fraction of total American petroleum production that it was essentially a rounding error in monthly output statistics. The reverberations from Bismarck Sea echoed through the remainder of the Pacific War, influencing strategic decisions and tactical development on both sides. The battle proved conclusively that air power alone could control sea lanes without requiring surface naval vessels to be physically present. It demonstrated that industrial innovation, when properly applied and adequately resourced, could create entirely new forms of warfare faster than enemies could develop effective counters. For Japanese forces, the battle marked the beginning of the end of their position in the Southwest Pacific. Cut off from reinforcement and adequate supply by American air dominance, they would fight a series of desperate holding actions, each one ending in either annihilation or slow death by starvation and disease. The island-hopping strategy that would characterize American operations for the remainder of the war became viable specifically because Japanese garrisons could be isolated and bypassed, left to wither without supplies, while American forces advanced past them toward more strategic objectives. The success at Bismarck Sea directly accelerated B-25 development programs. The B-25G model, entering service in late 1943, carried a massive 75mm cannon in its nose, making it the largest weapon ever successfully mounted on a twin-engine bomber. Though this cannon would ultimately prove less practical than carrying multiple machine guns for most missions, its development demonstrated American willingness to experiment with radical concepts and the industrial capability to implement changes rapidly once a concept showed promise. Each new iteration of the B-25 reflected lessons learned from combat operations and incorporated suggestions from pilots and maintenance crews, showing an adaptive process that continuously improved the aircraft's combat effectiveness. Post-war analysis of captured Japanese documents and interrogations of surviving officers revealed just how thoroughly the Bismarck Sea defeat had shaken Japanese confidence in their own capabilities. Intelligence reports circulated within the combined fleet began emphasizing American material superiority rather than tactical superiority, a significant shift from earlier assessments that had attributed American successes primarily to luck or to specific Japanese mistakes that could be corrected. One captured report stated explicitly that the enemy's massive production capacity allowed them to implement new tactical concepts faster than Japanese forces could develop and deploy effective countermeasures. This recognition of fundamental industrial disadvantage marked a crucial shift in Japanese strategic thinking, an acknowledgement that they were fighting an enemy whose material resources vastly exceeded their own. Following Bismarck Sea, Imperial General Headquarters conducted a comprehensive review of Japanese strategy across the entire Southwest Pacific Theater. The conclusions reached were sobering for Japanese planners. Surface reinforcement of forward bases was no longer operationally possible within range of Allied aircraft. American air power had achieved operational supremacy that couldn't be meaningfully challenged given current Japanese capabilities. The industrial and technological gap between Japan and America was widening rather than narrowing, meaning the situation would only deteriorate further over time. Traditional Japanese naval superiority, which had been a cornerstone of pre-war planning, was essentially irrelevant if ships couldn't survive air attacks long enough to engage enemy surface vessels. The recommended strategy emerging from this review was to abandon offensive operations entirely and instead prepare for defense of the inner perimeter surrounding the Japanese home islands. But even this fundamentally defensive strategy rested on the assumption that American attacks would come at a pace that Japan could match, an assumption that would prove tragically optimistic as American production and operational tempo continued accelerating. The skip bombing technique that had been pioneered and perfected for the Bismarck Sea attack spread rapidly throughout American military forces operating across the Pacific. Navy PBY Catalinas adopted the technique for night attacks against Japanese coastal shipping. Marine Corps pilots employed it during operations in the Solomons campaign against both shipping and shore installations. Even transport pilots received training in the basic technique in case they encountered enemy shipping during their flights. This rapid proliferation was made possible by America's standardized training systems, equipment commonality across units, and effective communication networks. A technique developed and perfected in New Guinea could be implemented by units operating in the Aleutians within a matter of weeks, with instructional materials, modified aircraft, and trained personnel all moving through established channels. Japanese forces, divided by deep service rivalries between Army and Navy and hampered by poor communication between units, rarely managed to share innovations effectively even within the same theatre of operations, let alone across different regions. The stark numbers tell the story of American industrial supremacy that made the Bismarck Sea victory not just possible, but almost inevitable given sufficient time for American production to reach full capacity. During the entirety of World War II, American factories produced 9,816 B-25 Mitchell bombers, representing just one model of medium bomber among many types being manufactured simultaneously. Ammunition plants scattered across the United States manufactured approximately 12 billion rounds of 50 caliber ammunition during the war years. Flight training schools graduated 193,440 pilots, far more than could possibly be used simultaneously, creating a deep reserve of trained aviators. Every critical B-25 component was stockpiled in multiple locations across the Pacific Theatre, ensuring that spare parts would be available wherever they were needed. Against this tidal wave of industrial production, Japanese military courage and fighting spirit, while undeniably real and often remarkable, were simply irrelevant. The bravest samurai warrior couldn't overcome the cold mathematics of mass production and industrial capacity. Pappy-Gunn's camera installations, which documented the attack in such detail, provided unprecedented opportunity for scientific analysis of combat effectiveness. The film footage was studied frame by analysts, revealing optimal tactics with precision that had never before been possible. The analysis determined that bomb release at altitudes between 200 and 250 feet, approach speeds of approximately 245 miles per hour, and release distances of 60 to 100 feet from the target provided maximum effectiveness in terms of hit probability and bomb penetration. This scientific approach to warfare, carefully measuring every variable, analyzing results systematically, and continuously optimizing tactics based on empirical data, represented a quintessentially American approach to military problems. War became an engineering challenge with industrial solutions rather than a test of warrior spirit or individual heroism. Japanese forces, steeped in centuries of martial tradition, found this industrialized approach to combat almost incomprehensible, a way of war that seemed to strip away everything that gave combat meaning in traditional terms. The loss of supplies when the convoy was destroyed created an immediate and severe economic crisis for Japanese forces throughout New Guinea. Within just a few weeks of the battle, frontline units were reporting critical shortages across every category of supplies. Ammunition was restricted to 10 rounds per day per soldier, barely enough for defensive fire, let alone offensive operations. Rice rations, the staple of Japanese military diet, were reduced to just 400 grams daily, insufficient for men engaged in combat operations in tropical conditions. Medical supplies were completely exhausted, meaning even minor wounds could become fatal through infection. Fuel for vehicles became unavailable, immobilizing transport and forcing units to rely on human porters for moving supplies. Aircraft were grounded for lack of spare parts and fuel, surrendering air superiority completely. American forces operating in the same theatre, by stark contrast, had such abundant supplies that soldiers would sometimes complain if ice cream wasn't available daily at mess facilities. The economic disparity between the two sides was so vast that captured Japanese soldiers often refused to believe what they were shown of American supply levels, assuming they were being shown propaganda rather than genuine logistics operations. Success at Bismarck Sea accelerated American innovation across multiple aspects of aerial warfare. Within just a few months of the battle, new developments were being implemented at an impressive pace. Improved skip-bombing fuses with more reliable delay mechanisms reduced the already low failure rate even further. Napalm, a jellied gasoline mixture that stuck to targets and burned intensely, was developed for area attacks against Japanese defensive positions. Rocket-assisted bombs were created to provide increased penetration against fortified targets. White phosphorus markers were perfected for target identification, creating distinctive white smoke that following aircraft could easily see and aim for. Each innovation built upon the fundamental industrial capacity to experiment with new concepts, test them under controlled conditions, and then rapidly implement successful ideas across the entire force. Americans could afford failed experiments because they cost only materials and time, both of which America had in abundance. Japanese innovation, by contrast, stagnated because every experiment consumed irreplaceable resources, and failures couldn't be easily absorbed given the limited industrial base. Behind every B-25 that participated in the attack at Bismarck Sea stood a dedicated maintenance crew working in primitive conditions to keep aircraft flying. These men, often working in jungle clearings with improvised tools and limited facilities, performed what can only be described as daily mechanical miracles. They overhauled engines in jungle workshops using basic equipment. They repaired extensive battle damage with improvised materials and creative solutions. They implemented field modifications using only hand tools and ingenuity. They turned aircraft around between combat missions in just a few hours, sometimes working through the night to ensure maximum availability for the next day's operations. This maintenance capability reflected America's deep pool of technical expertise. Hundreds of thousands of American men had civilian experience working with engines, repairing electrical systems, and working with metal, skills they'd learned in civilian jobs before the war. This vast reservoir of technical knowledge and practical skill was perhaps America's greatest military advantage, one that showed up not in dramatic combat, but in the unglamorous day-to-day work of keeping complex machinery functioning under difficult conditions. The strafing of survivors in the water, which remains controversial even among military historians, served a harsh but calculable military purpose beyond the immediate tactical objective. Japanese forces throughout the Pacific Theatre learned through bitter experience that attempting to reach shore after their ships were sunk meant facing likely death from air or surface attack. This psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of Bismarck Sea, affecting Japanese morale and decision-making in future engagements. Soldiers and sailors knew that even if they survived their ship sinking, their ordeal was far from over, adding another layer of stress to an already terrifying situation. General Douglas MacArthur, in his official communiqué about the battle, called Bismarck Sea the decisive aerial engagement in the Southwest Pacific Theatre. His initial reports somewhat inflated Japanese losses, as often happened with battle damage assessments made in the heat of combat, but the strategic impact fully justified his enthusiasm. Air power had definitively proven it could interdict sea lanes as effectively as submarines or surface vessels, fundamentally changing the calculus of Pacific warfare. Admiral Yamamoto, after reading the detailed battle reports from surviving officers, made a fateful decision, driven at least partially by the depression and concern following the Bismarck Sea defeat. He would personally visit forward bases to boost morale that had been badly shattered by the catastrophic loss. This decision, made in response to the psychological impact of Bismarck Sea, would lead directly to his death on April 18, 1943. American codebreakers learned of his planned itinerary through their ongoing decryption of Japanese naval communications. P-38 Lightning fighters were dispatched to intercept his transport aircraft over Bougainville, and they successfully shot down the plane carrying the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. In a sense, Yamamoto became another casualty of Bismarck Sea, killed indirectly by the consequences of that defeat. American forces rapidly institutionalized the lessons learned from Bismarck Sea, incorporating them into standard doctrine and training programs. Within just a few weeks of the battle, training manuals were being updated to include detailed skip bombing techniques. New pilots arriving in the Pacific Theater were already practicing low-level attack profiles before they ever saw combat. Tactical doctrine was formally revised to emphasize anti-shipping operations as a primary mission for medium bombers. The Army Air Force's Tactical Center conducted detailed analysis of every aspect of the battle, producing comprehensive reports that were distributed throughout the Pacific Theater and even sent back to training facilities in the United States. Japanese institutional learning, by contrast, was severely hampered by multiple systemic problems. Deep service rivalries between Army and Navy prevented honest analysis and meaningful cooperation. Each service tended to blame the other for failures, rather than examining fundamental weaknesses in their own capabilities. Face-saving cultural concerns often obscured failures or led to misleading reports that downplayed the extent of defeats. By the time Japanese forces managed to develop partial counters to skip bombing techniques, American forces had already moved on to implementing new tactics that exploited different vulnerabilities. The B-25 modifications that proved so devastatingly effective at Bismarck Sea immediately went into mass production at American factories. North American Aviation's manufacturing facilities in Kansas City and Inglewood, California, retooled their production lines within just a few weeks of receiving detailed specifications. By late 1943, brand new B-25s were coming directly from the factory equipped with 8 to 14 forward-firing machine guns as standard equipment, reinforced nose structures specifically designed to accommodate gun installations, upgraded engines optimized for low-level performance rather than high-altitude operations, improved armor protection for crew members in critical positions, and built-in camera installations for documenting battle results. This rapid transition from field modification implemented with hand tools and salvaged parts to mass production of factory-built aircraft exemplified American industrial flexibility that Japan simply couldn't match given its more limited industrial base and production capacity. After Bismarck Sea, American bomber crew training programs incorporated low-level attack techniques as standard curriculum rather than specialized training for select units. Pilots practiced skip bombing at training bases scattered across Texas and Arizona, using target ships positioned in the Gulf of Mexico and California's Salton Sea. This training consumed enormous amounts of aviation fuel, with each pilot burning thousands of gallons while learning and perfecting the technique. But America could easily afford such fuel-intensive training. By 1943, American refineries were producing approximately 1.5 billion gallons of aviation fuel annually, while Japan struggled desperately to import enough fuel to keep its fleet operational and its aircraft flying even minimal missions. Several B-25s returned from the Bismarck Sea attack with significant battle damage, including holes from anti-aircraft fire that had penetrated wings and fuselage, damaged control surfaces that made the aircraft difficult to handle, and engines that had been hit by fragments and were running roughly or losing power. Within 72 hours of landing, every single one of these damaged aircraft was back in the air and ready for combat operations. Repairs were accomplished using aluminum patches fabricated in field workshops with basic metalworking tools, replacement engines installed using improvised hoists and makeshift equipment, control cables spliced together using salvaged materials and innovative techniques, and fuel tanks patched with rubber salvaged from destroyed Japanese equipment. Japanese aircraft suffering similar levels of damage would typically have been written off as total losses, perhaps cannibalized for any salvageable spare parts that could be used to keep other aircraft flying, but unlikely to ever fly again themselves. The delayed action fuses that made skip bombing tactically viable were themselves marvels of precision engineering, manufactured to extraordinarily tight tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. These fuses had to survive the violent impact of hitting the water's surface at speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour, continue functioning reliably after skipping multiple times across the wavetops, and detonate at precisely the right moment, neither too early nor too late. American factories produced these sophisticated fuses by the millions during the war years, with each individual unit tested and certified to ensure it met specifications. Japanese fuses, by comparison, suffered from failure rates that exceeded 20% by 1943, a consequence of deteriorating quality control as the war progressed and increasing material shortages that forced the use of substandard components. American aircraft located the Japanese convoy precisely when and where intelligence had predicted, despite significant distance from their bases and challenging weather conditions. This successful navigation reflected multiple American advantages in training and equipment. American pilots typically accumulated approximately 400 hours of flight time before being assigned to combat units, giving them extensive experience with navigation under various conditions. Navigation equipment on American aircraft was generally reliable and accurate, including quality compasses and instruments that functioned properly. Map quality was excellent, with detailed charts created from pre-war surveys and updated with reconnaissance information. Weather forecasting provided to American units was remarkably accurate, based on a sophisticated meteorological support network that could predict conditions with reasonable precision. Japanese navigation capabilities, by contrast, increasingly relied on simply following lead aircraft or using coastal landmarks for guidance, significantly limiting operational flexibility and making it difficult to operate effectively in poor weather or at night. American intelligence had obtained detailed information about the convoy through successful code-breaking operations, but this priceless advantage had to be carefully protected at all costs. Reconnaissance flights were deliberately staged to discover the convoy through visual observation, maintaining the fiction that it was aircraft spotting rather than signals intelligence that had provided the critical warning. This elaborate deception was executed so skillfully and consistently that Japanese military forces never realized throughout the entire war that their supposedly secure codes had been compromised from early in the conflict. They continued using the same encryption systems that American and Allied cryptographers could read almost in real time, providing invaluable intelligence throughout the Pacific War. The 1,200 Japanese soldiers who eventually reached Leh discovered a garrison that was already operating on significantly reduced rations even before the convoy's destruction. The massive quantities of supplies that were supposed to sustain operations for months, allowing Japanese forces to conduct offensive operations and defend against Allied attacks, had been sent to the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. Within just a few weeks, Japanese forces were desperately foraging for food in the surrounding jungle, trying to supplement inadequate rations with anything edible they could find. Disease rapidly became epidemic among the malnourished and stressed troops. Malaria, spread by the abundant mosquitoes in tropical conditions, struck down hundreds of men. Dysentery, caused by contaminated water and poor sanitation, weakened soldiers and killed many. Tropical ulcers, which developed from minor cuts and scratches in the hot, humid conditions, became major medical problems. Malnutrition itself became a primary cause of casualties. By June 1943, just 3 months after the battle, the effective combat strength of Japanese forces at Leh had been reduced by approximately 60% through disease and starvation alone, without significant combat casualties. American pilots participating in the Bismarck Sea attack were serving limited combat tours, typically either 50 combat missions or 6 months of continuous combat operations, whichever came first, before being rotated back to the United States. This rotation system served multiple important purposes. It preserved the lives and sanity of experienced combat veterans who would otherwise have continued flying until they were killed. It disseminated hard-won combat experience throughout the entire force, as returning veterans became instructors at training bases, passing on their knowledge and techniques to the next generation of pilots heading to the Pacific. It maintained pilot morale by giving men a light at the end of the tunnel, a defined endpoint to their combat service. Japanese pilots, by stark contrast, flew continuous combat operations until they were killed, with no rotation system and no prospect of returning home. The accumulated expertise and combat wisdom these men gained through surviving multiple engagements was lost forever when they were finally shot down. By late 1943, most of the experienced Japanese pilots who had started the war were dead, and their replacements were increasingly poorly trained novices with minimal flight time being thrown into combat against American veterans who had survived dozens of missions. The Battle of Bismarck Sea represented a convergence of multiple American technological and organizational advantages, each individually significant but together creating an overwhelming superiority. Industrial capacity provided the ability to produce modified aircraft in quantity and to rapidly implement successful innovations across the entire force. A cultural emphasis on innovation encouraged field modifications and allowed unconventional solutions to tactical problems. Extensive training resources permitted the perfecting of new tactics through countless practice runs before combat employment. Intelligence capabilities, both signals intelligence and reconnaissance, enabled the precise location of targets and the optimal timing of attacks. Communication systems facilitated the coordination of complex attacks involving multiple aircraft types from different units and even different nations. Supply chains sustained intensive operations far from home bases, ensuring that fuel, ammunition, and spare parts were always available when needed. No single one of these advantages would have been decisive by itself. Their combination, however, created a form of warfare that Japan simply couldn't match or counter effectively. The Battle of Bismarck Sea proved definitively that air power, when properly employed and adequately resourced, could control sea lanes without requiring the physical presence of naval vessels. Industrial innovation had demonstrated its ability to create entirely new forms of warfare faster than enemies could develop and deploy effective countermeasures. American production capacity had shown that quantity, when properly organized and intelligently applied, possessed a quality all its own. For Japanese military forces, Bismarck Sea represented far more than a tactical defeat or even a strategic setback. It constituted definitive proof that their entire philosophical approach to warfare had become fundamentally obsolete in the face of industrial modernity. Traditional martial virtues like courage, fighting spirit, and warrior tradition, values deeply embedded in Japanese military culture through centuries of samurai heritage, meant essentially nothing when facing American B-25s equipped with 8 forward-firing machine guns and skip bombs. The best trained warrior, operating with perfect technique and absolute courage, was completely helpless against an enemy who had industrialized warfare itself, treating combat as an engineering problem to be solved through technology and production rather than as a test of martial valor. The 2,890 Japanese soldiers and sailors who perished in the waters of the Bismarck Sea were, in a very real sense, victims not merely of American bombs and bullets, but of a technological and industrial revolution that had rendered their entire form of warfare as obsolete and irrelevant as samurai swords against machine guns. These men had trained for war conducted according to traditional concepts of military honor and individual combat prowess. Instead, they died in an industrialized war fought with machines and systems that they had no realistic possibility of matching given Japan's limited industrial base. For American forces, Bismarck Sea represented validation of years of preparation, experimentation, and innovation in the Pacific theater. Pappy Guns field modifications, initially developed with salvaged parts and implemented using hand tools in jungle workshops, had proven more devastatingly effective than any purpose-built weapon system that existed in pre-war arsenals. The marriage of American ingenuity, that practical problem-solving approach to challenges, with vast industrial capacity, had produced an entirely new form of warfare that Japanese forces simply couldn't counter with their available resources and traditional military thinking. The battle's legacy extended far beyond the immediate geographic confines of the Southwest Pacific Theater. Bismarck Sea demonstrated definitively and undeniably that in modern industrialized warfare, industrial capacity essentially equals military capacity. The nation capable of building the most weapons, training the most personnel, innovating the fastest, and adapting the quickest to changing circumstances would ultimately prevail regardless of traditional military virtues. Courage, loyalty, and self-sacrifice remained important human qualities, valued in any military force, but they were no longer sufficient by themselves to determine the outcome of modern wars. Superior production and technology could overwhelm even the most courageous and dedicated forces. In those 15 minutes over the Bismarck Sea waters, 8 modified bomber aircraft accomplished what the entire Imperial Japanese Navy, with all its accumulated tradition and expertise, couldn't prevent. They severed Japan's maritime supply lines and condemned Japanese forces throughout New Guinea to a slow death through starvation and disease. Those 15 minutes marked the historical moment when industrial warfare definitively and irreversibly replaced traditional military concepts throughout the Pacific Theater. The Japanese soldiers and sailors who witnessed the attack and couldn't believe what they were seeing were entirely correct to be incredulous. They were observing something that shouldn't have been possible according to everything they understood about naval warfare and military operations. But American industrial innovation, combined with a willingness to experiment and adapt, had transformed the impossible into routine, had turned the unthinkable into standard operating procedure. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea stands as definitive historical proof that in the age of modern warfare, the nation possessing the most productive factories will defeat the nation fielding the bravest individual soldiers. This was a brutal lesson written in flame and blood across the waters of Huon Gulf, a lesson that would define and determine the remainder of the Pacific War's trajectory. In an era of industrial warfare, production capacity is power, innovation becomes strategy itself, and the assembly line ultimately proves mightier than even the sharpest sword wielded by the most skilled warrior. The Japanese military establishment could not initially believe or accept what they witnessed when modified B-25 Mitchell bombers destroyed 8 transport ships in just 15 minutes of sustained attack. By the time Japanese forces fully accepted and internalized this new reality, understanding that warfare had fundamentally changed in ways that favored American industrial strength, it was already far too late to alter the war's ultimate outcome. The war had effectively been lost not during those 15 minutes of spectacular destruction over the Bismarck Sea, but during the preceding years of American industrial preparation and innovation that had made those 15 minutes of devastation possible. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea simply represented the moment when that long-prepared American victory became undeniably and spectacularly visible to all who witnessed it, friend and foe alike.